Hi, I'm Steve Clemons, and I have a question. With both the Republican and the Democratic parties offering Israel unconditional support as it decimates life in Gaza day by day, can the Palestinians expect any change after Inauguration Day? Let's get to the bottom line. In his last few days in office, President Joe Biden has announced an $8 billion weapons deal for Israel and reaffirmed U.S. unconditional support. Meanwhile, Israeli forces continue their bombing campaigns throughout Gaza, which now have killed more than 45,000 Palestinians, mostly women and children. Food is scarce, the winter is harsh, and Israel has destroyed the last functioning hospital in the northern part of the Strip and detained the hospital director. President-elect Donald Trump pledges unwavering support to Israel as well, but says he wants the war to wind down. So are we about to see changes in U.S. policy in the region, or is there just going to be more of the same? Today we're speaking with author and journalist Ryan Grim, co-founder of Dropsite News. Ryan, thanks so much for joining us. Listen, we're at the tail end of the Biden administration, and you've been watching this conflict as long as I have, but particularly since October 7th and what's happened on all sides of this Middle East quagmire. And the punctuation point ending the Biden administration is a new $8 billion aid package to Israel in this crisis. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, aid package is one way to put it. Yeah, just, it's inventorying the entire warehouse of weapons in the United States and just quickly shipping off whatever we're not going to send to Ukraine, directly to Israel. It's not even clear what on earth Israel would be using $8 billion worth of weapons for when, they claim that they're, on the brink of a ceasefire. They're supposed to have struck a ceasefire with Lebanon. I think they're running out of reasons to bomb Syria. I know that they were doing some saber rattling with Egypt recently, but I can't imagine that they're going to launch attacks on Egypt. Iran is extraordinarily weakened. But I guess if you're a Democratic administration and you've got weapons left over, you just send them to Israel before your time expires.
I mean, you just noticed that we're, again, reporting they were close to a ceasefire. I can't tell you the number of times I've heard that and had various spokespeople and commentators and observers saying they don't buy it. I think we're probably the realest show in this that has no hope on that front. But do you have any serious hope with Donald Trump coming in that there could actually be a ceasefire?
Yeah, the only reason there would be some hope is that, Trump has very publicly said that he wants a ceasefire and he wants it by January 20th. And so, Netanyahu then has to decide whether or not, he wants to start off the Trump administration, where he's already kind of on his back foot, if people remember, because Trump was mad at Netanyahu for congratulating Joe Biden on winning the 2020 presidential election. I think, Trump has, privately said some kind of fairly nasty things about Netanyahu. So Netanyahu is not in as strong a position personally as he is kind of geopolitically with Trump and the United States. And so the question for Netanyahu is, does he want to buck Trump right away by continuing the war after January 20th? So that's the only reason I think that around January 20th, we might actually get a ceasefire. Now, whether it holds or whether it's just something that's announced so that Trump can celebrate it and say he's moving on, and then it picks up again in a lighter form going forward. Lighter form meaning 2 million people suffering the most unimaginable humanitarian conditions that you can possibly contemplate. But you can imagine it just going on indefinitely, yet calling it a ceasefire.
Ryan, President Biden advised Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu, don't go into Rafah, don't use 2-ton bombs in residential neighborhoods, don't provoke Iran directly, don't launch a full war in Lebanon, don't occupy more Syrian lands. When you kind of look at it, Netanyahu's been on a roll, and everything that that President Joe Biden asked to do just got brushed aside. I'm just interested in this relationship now and what the implications are of that. And what it means in your eyes when you see an American president so easily brushed aside. And now, actually, you hear from the Secretary of State and Joe Biden taking credit for a lot of what has unfolded in the Middle East.
Right. It's been utterly humiliating for Biden and for his team. You saw the New York Times interview with Antony Blinken recently, where that exact question was put to him, where he said, "You told him not to go into Rafah. They went into Rafah," and he said, "Aha, but they went into Rafah in a different way than they were planning to. And if you look at aerial footage or on the ground footage of Rafah, they have completely destroyed the place, left it in utter and total ruin and rubble. And so how that's different from what Blinken told them not to do is left unsaid. The gap there is just the total humiliation of Democrats and of Joe Biden. Back in around December, it seems fairly clear, and people were saying this in Israeli media roughly at the time, but certainly since then, that Netanyahu made a calculation around December of 2023, January 2024, that there was a strong enough chance that Donald Trump was going to win the White House, that he was going to completely ignore anything that came from the White House that was short of weapons restrictions, and that there might even be some weapons restrictions as a result of his refusing to follow the kind of suggestions, the gentle suggestions made by the Biden administration. So he made that calculation. I'm going to spend a year taking some public heat from the Biden White House, but I'm going to bank on Trump taking office come next January, and that paid off for him.
Could you see one day the world organizing against American leaders for what they've seen unfold, which many are terming a genocide in Gaza?
I think you could see it. I think you're going to, first you're going to see what we're currently seeing, which is Israeli soldiers who have, traveled abroad for vacation, posting on their public social media that they have, gone to these particular countries, and then the Hind Rajab Foundation and others sending evidence of war crimes to those countries. So far, all of those soldiers have managed to escape those countries and get back to Israel in time before they have been arrested and charged with war crimes. I think first what you'll see is some of those soldiers will actually get arrested and get charged. That will create an enormous amount of international attention. If that holds, people are going to say, wait a minute, obviously war criminals should be imprisoned, but these are the lowest ranking criminals. These are the literal foot soldiers. Like, what about the people who issued the orders? Already Israeli leadership is quite hemmed in about where they can travel internationally because of ICC warrants. You could imagine, I think, a world in which American power is enough in competition with China that countries felt as if they had the actual political ability to carry out their obligations under the Rome Statute, and that the benefits they might get from the rest of the world for doing that might outweigh the costs they would suffer from the United States. That depends on what happens with the United States' power in the world over the next several years. But you could also imagine, is the Trump administration going to lift much of a finger to defend Biden administration officials? I don't see that.
Do you think China may be a game changer potentially in this story to take it a different direction that we may not be thinking of today?
I think they're certainly watching. Like they are, I think they're allowing the United States to continue to play its hand and see where it goes from there. I think if the U.S. is successful in kind of basically carrying out this genocide and then creating normalization between Israel, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE, and creating that kind of security architecture that they have been dreaming of for decades at this point, and eliminating the Palestinians as a material question in the Mideast. Like, if the genocide is effectively successful, then you might see China say, all right, well, they played a vicious hand and they succeeded at it. But they also may not succeed at that. The odds are stacked against them. There are millions of human beings that we're talking about, and they're not all going somewhere, and they can't kill all of them. And so if it does remain a fluid situation, I could imagine you could see China come in while maintaining its it loves to say we don't believe in interference in other countries' domestic affairs because they don't want anybody telling them what to do internally. But like you said, they broached that. détente between Iran and Saudi Arabia. They did some work, bridging divides within the kind of Palestinian politics. So, could they offer themselves as a less chaotic mediator in the region? I think certainly. Like what the U.S. has to show for its quote unquote mediation over the decades is a body count in the millions and endless chaos. So at some point, you could imagine people in the region looking for a different direction.
Another weird feature of the topography right now in this region is in the Palestinian side of things. Palestinian Authority ratcheting down its own people in Jenin. Al Jazeera, candidly, is under a lot of pressure to be squeezed out of Palestinian Authority because of its reporting on Mahmoud Abbas and what's going on in the brigades that are killing Palestinians. I'm just sort of interested at this moment. If you're in Gaza, or you're in the West Bank, and you're a citizen, and you're not attached to Hamas, let's just be clear. I think sometimes there is a recklessness in American media, I want to be honest, about confusing who's who and whatever, that no matter what you think about October 7th and Hamas, there are many, 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 many innocent Palestinians in this situation who are now under siege by their own government. What are your thoughts there?
It's an interesting game that Israel's playing, like you said, and particularly in the West Bank, but also in Gaza. But in Gaza, they are effectively, like you said, they're trying to eliminate Hamas as a governing authority there, and all the evidence suggests that they are deliberately allowing the flourishing of basically armed gangs in Gaza. Over in the West Bank, a lot of Israeli politicians are saying that they need to just basically choke the life out of the PA, withholding salaries, constantly making their kind of security role that they have as a kind of subcontractor for the Israeli government much more difficult. And it almost seems as if they're hoping that there will be some type of armed conflict in the West Bank that would then allow for something similar there that's happening in Gaza. But like I said, it's an extraordinarily dangerous game. It's not obvious, where that ends and whether it necessarily ends well for Israelis or the Israeli government.
I got a private communication from a senior editor in American media. I can't mention the individual's name, but this individual said, Steve, you and many others don't get it. This is like, Israel, following the model of Americans basically moving Native Americans off their lands in the United States and spreading. And he said, and I'm just interested, when you hear that, what's your response to that sort of logic that some people at senior levels in American media have, that this is just nothing more than what America did in taking on Native American Indians in the United States?
Well, I think it's correct. I think most Americans who would say something like that would say it with a pejorative behind it, that we're not actually proud of the fact that we did that, but we acknowledge that it happened, and with the benefit of hindsight and the benefit of it being a fait accompli that won't be reversed by our apologizing for it, that we apologize for it. It's extraordinarily kind of startling, I think, for people to use something that is universally accepted as a genocide as the rationale for what they are currently doing, and use that as a defense.
Along the way, I want to play a clip of President Trump's comments about this situation with his new Middle East envoy, who's been negotiating to try to get these hostages released, Steve Witkoff. Let's listen.
If those hostages aren't back, I don't want to hurt your negotiation. If they're not back by the time I get into office, all hell will break out in the Middle East. Can you elaborate? And it will not be good for Hamas, and it will not be good, frankly, for anyone. All hell will break out. I don't have to say anymore, but that's what it is.
Ryan, what do you do with something like that, of the incoming president laying out a potential nightmarish scenario with no detail? What's the responsible way to frame that, respond to it? What do you believe Trump is saying?
And from Palestinians that we speak to on the ground in Gaza, he's been saying that now for for several weeks, different versions of it, and it's gallows humor in Gaza when they hear that, because the question is, what does he think the situation is right now? Like, it already is, absolute hell on earth. Like, and it goes from a kind of dark joke to an actual question of, wait, we are currently being starved, dying of disease, frostbitten, flooded, and being bombed around the clock. It becomes a legitimate question. What more actually do you think you can do? Like, right now, there's a handful of trucks that are going in. So you're going to take that to zero? And it becomes an open question. Like, what do you mean? Like, you've kind of taken turning it into hell on earth off the table by already turning it into hell on earth. But his point, I feel like, is also directed at Netanyahu, that he's emphasizing how serious he is about just not wanting to deal with this as part of his presidency, and telling Netanyahu, get this done. And so I think that's why there's a reasonable chance that that they do announce some kind of ceasefire, whether it holds or not, I don't know, around January 19th or January 20th. And it's also why, I was saying in December or so, when they were saying, oh, we're days away from a deal. No, Netanyahu knows he has until January 20th at least, and he's going to use every minute of that to unleash this hell on earth.
From your sense of things, do you think Trump has an opportunity to get a Saudi peace deal with Israel?
I think he certainly does. The question is, what level of humiliation is kind of Saudi Arabia willing to accept when it comes to not getting anything on the question of Palestine? And that really remains to be seen. I do think, the Gulf leaders in general, in their own private moments, would sign off on anything, and the Abraham Accords, I think, show that they're willing to effectively sidestep the question and just pretend the question of Palestine doesn't exist. It does, but perhaps Saudi Arabia will accept some type of language that says there will be a future state in discussion that doesn't really have any that doesn't really meet our nominal understanding of what a state is, especially as Israel looks increasingly intent on continuing to settle the West Bank and expelling people from there, and settling northern Gaza and expelling people from there as well.
Ryan, one of the things I really appreciate in your reporting, as I've known for many, many years, is you're not only writing about the macro things, you're talking to real people. People trust you with their information. You're talking to human beings and putting things in a human context. And I've been taken with the fact that you've covered recently, posthumously, a Palestinian from Gaza who was killed by Israel early in the war, and his name was Rifat al-Arir, in a book he published called If I Must Die. And in this was a guy who never picked up a gun. He was an English teacher, outspoken about his situation, and he was killed. I'm interested in your take on this and what message you think we should all hear that Rifat al-Arir was trying to communicate.
Yeah, a lot of people probably read at some point his poem, If I Must Die, which came out, didn't come out, it came out in 2012, I believe, but it became a viral sensation, after he was killed in a targeted strike by Israel. He was in a second-story apartment, and that was the only apartment that was hit, and he was hit after, he was warned by Israeli government officials that he would be killed. He and many of his close family members were killed in that strike as well. It was dedicated to his young daughter, his young daughter, her husband, and their infant son. They were killed in April of last year as well. And the book, it's one of the best books I've read, frankly. And some of the weight, I'm sure, is driven by knowing how his story ends. But reading his interviews, reading his essays, reading his poems is a profound experience. And I would recommend the book. It's called If I Must Die, published by OR Books. I had nothing to do with the publication of it. But it's a tremendous work in its ability to kind of humanize the experience of what he had lived through. And he talks about how he decided to learn English and write in English because he wanted to learn the language of his colonizer, of his oppressor, so that he could reach them heart to heart, so that people like me who don't speak Arabic could read his poems, read his words, and understand his human condition. And he pulled that off, I think, probably beyond his wildest dreams. And he was killed for it. And one of the things he says is that as poets, we need to stop saying that somebody is just a poet, that they were killed even though they were only a poet, when in fact, the pen really is in many ways mightier than the sword.
Just as a quick follow-up, because I'm very taken with what you said, we just saw the destruction of the last functioning hospital in the Strip, the detention of the hospital director, but there are many others like Rafid al-Arir who were poets, intellectuals, TikTok stars, etc. These are not warriors that have been, silenced and killed. And I'm interested in whether or not we are doing enough. Frankly, I have wrote a piece for The Atlantic some years ago on the heroic actions of the Rockefeller Foundation in saving harassed Jewish intellectuals in 1930s Europe. Many of them brought them to the United States. And it was complicated because the Rockefeller Foundation wasn't set up to do that. But looking at people that were targeted and saying they're individuals, it's a hard choice that matter so much because of what they bring and the voice they have. Are we failing completely on that front from your perspective?
I think we are, but I think the task is beyond us. I think the war has to end. That's the only way that the people that are in need of rescue and of saving and in just food and medicine are going to get it in any scale. I don't think any of us have the capacity to confront the depths of the evil that are on display right now. There's basic things that could be done easily, though. There are somewhere between 25 and 50,000 people that we know of who are in Gaza who are in need of critical care and could travel to get that care. Israel is blocking them from traveling. With the stroke of a pen, just a lifting of a finger, boom, like that's 25 to 50,000 lives right there that could be changed. More food could be allowed in, more medicine could be allowed in. Israel could stop attacking hospitals, but all of that requires Israeli action and United States action. So we can do what we can. We can lift up the stories of the heroes there who are doing everything they can to save others, but we can only do so much.
Well, listen, thank you. Journalist Ryan Grim, co-founder of Dropsite News. Really appreciate you joining us and for your candor today.
All right, thanks, Steve.
So what's the bottom line? It might have started with Gaza, but Israel's crisis has ballooned to include the West Bank, Lebanon, Syria, Iran, and Yemen, plus the International Criminal Court, plus a number of countries that have cut diplomatic relations in response to Israel's actions. Through it all, President Joe Biden and his national security team have stumbled badly every step of the way. Now the world awaits to see how President-elect Donald Trump is going to respond to the Gaza crisis. He's promising that, quote, all hell will break out. But what exactly does that mean? Especially for 2 million people totally fenced in with no hospitals, no food, and daily Israeli bombing campaigns. So far, nothing and no one has appeared in Trumpland to indicate that any change in the equation is on the horizon to stop the annihilation of Palestinians and their national aspirations. And that, sadly, is the bottom line.